They told us the Imperium was humanity's greatest hope, a colossus of unity stretched across a hostile galaxy. But hope is a luxury the lowborn are forbidden to touch. In the darkened holds beneath hive spires, in the shadowed corridors of orbital factorums, in the dust-choked pits where lives are measured not in years but in quotas, the truth of the Imperium becomes clear. It is a machine built on flesh, a machine that demands obedience, silence, and blood. And for those born into chains, officially or otherwise, existence is not life. It is labor without mercy. It is pain without purpose. It is slavery woven so deeply into the Imperium's bones that it vanishes in plain sight. If you want more stories pulled from the deepest shadows of Warhammer 40K, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support summons more voices out of the dark. The first sound I remember was the hiss of the recyclers coughing stale air into the dark. The second was the clang of a distant lift, descending, its rust-choked cables shivering as though the hive itself were afraid. I was born beneath all of it, beneath the lights of the hab stacks, beneath the gears of the manufactorums, beneath the notice of anyone who mattered. My world was made of narrow corridors and ferrocrete sweat that dripped from overhead pipes like the hive was crying for us. Though no one down here truly believed the hive cared, it devoured more than it produced. It devoured lives, and I was one of the many who would be swallowed without ceremony. No one taught me the meaning of slavery. The reality was carved into the rhythm of each day. Wake when the Vox grill crackled, stumble into the corridor, accept the ration packet shoved into your hand, join the march toward whatever manufactorum level your shift code demanded. We were not bound by chains. We were bound by necessity, by the unspoken knowledge that without compliance we would be discarded like machinery too damaged to repair. There were no collars around our necks because none were needed. Everyone's fear was collar enough. When I was a child, if one can call those years childhood, I thought the flickering lumen strips above us were stars. When one burst in a shower of sparks, I thought I had watched a star die. It was only later, when a tech adept descended to replace it, that I learned the truth. Even the stars in our lives were false. That tech adept was the first person I ever saw who wasn't shaped like the rest of us. His limbs were too long, too jointed. His face was half covered with stained brass and curling tubes that breathed for him in a hissing cadence. Behind him marched two skitterai, metal-eyed and emotionless, their rifles held at low ready. None of us dared speak as they passed. I held my breath, afraid a single exhale might draw their attention. Fear was a constant here, like recycled air, thin, metallic, never enough. Most days began and ended in the manufactorum, where we processed raw ore into feeder lines for the upper hive. The machinery was ancient, older than the overseers who shouted at us through their Vox amplifiers, older than the families who had lived and died under its watch. Its conveyor belts were loud enough to drown thought, and its furnaces hungry enough to melt anything unlucky enough to fall in. More than once, I watched a body being dragged out from beneath a cogitator stack, limbs twisted wrong, eyes staring upward as though seeking the Emperor's distant light and finding only ash. No prayers were offered for the dead. Prayer was reserved for those who mattered. Those who mattered never set foot down here. The overseers didn't bother learning our names. They called us by numbers stenciled onto our coats. I was C-9482, a designation I came to wear like a second skin. Names were luxuries. They gave people individuality, and individuality was dangerous. You could lose a number and be replaced, but names gave others reason to remember you, and remembrance tended to complicate punishment. For the first few years, I thought the overseers were the highest authority in the universe. They stood tall with their shock staves and servo-limb augmetics, moving through the manufactorum with an air of entitlement that seemed divine. When they shouted, we bent. When they commanded, we obeyed. When they punished, we endured. Only later did I understand they were merely the lowest rung of power, granted just enough authority to keep us silent. Above them were the tech adepts. Above the tech adepts were administratum clerks. Above them were nobles who rarely walked the hive floors. And above even them was terror, the shining jewel we were told to revere, yet would never behold. a world so distant and brilliant it may as well have been a myth. The first time I saw someone resist, it happened with the quiet intensity of a fault line cracking. The worker was old, older than anyone I'd seen in the manufactorum, which meant perhaps 40. Time aged us differently. Labor wore through the skin, hollowed the eyes, and bent the back long before years could. His number was faded, barely visible on his coat, and perhaps that fading gave him boldness. Perhaps he simply had no more fear to give. He missed a quota, not by much, 2 units short, but enough that an overseer stepped down from the catwalk, shock stave humming. The old man didn't cower, he didn't grovel. He simply asked, in a voice worn to a rasp, how a man with hands torn and bleeding from metal shards was expected to lift more. It was the closest thing to rebellion I had ever heard, and it silenced the entire manufactorum. For a moment, the overseer just stared. Then the stave swung. The crack of electricity lit the old man's frame with violent blue. He fell instantly. The overseer didn't check if he still breathed. He simply waved us back into motion. The conveyors resumed their rumbling. The furnaces roared. The hive swallowed another life. That day, I learned a truth that has never left me. The Imperium does not need to shout its cruelty. It only needs to enforce it once, and the memory becomes law. My world remained narrow for many years. Work, exhaustion, sleep forced upon me by sheer fatigue. The idea of anything beyond these halls was a fantasy. But fantasies are dangerous, because they make you question, and questions, even unspoken, were punished. When I was perhaps 12, though age was hard to track when shifts blurred together, I began to notice patterns. Certain sublevels were cordoned off at specific times. Certain overseers carried data slates containing orders they refused to share. And sometimes, very early in the morning, I would glimpse workers returning from areas none of us were ever assigned to. They moved differently, not stronger or freer, just haunted, as though they'd glimpsed something that peeled the flesh from their souls. I asked one of them once, quietly, while we waited for the conveyors to restart. He looked at me for a long moment before shaking his head. His lips parted as if to answer, then closed again. Fear won. It always did. Yet seeds of curiosity are stubborn. They burrow. They grow. One night, after the shift, instead of returning to the barracks bunk that barely fit my body, I followed a group of workers as they slipped past the main corridor and into an auxiliary maintenance shaft. My heart hammered harder than any cogitator piston. One misstep and the hive would swallow me whole, but something in me, something reckless, born of monotony and desperation, pushed me on. The shaft was narrow, lit only by dying lumens that flickered like gasps. The workers moved silently, shoulders hunched, as though carrying invisible burdens. I stayed far back, just close enough to see their silhouettes. Eventually, they stopped before a sealed pressure door marked with Mechanicus symbols. A tech adept awaited them, flanked by 2 Skitarii, whose visors glowed a faint red in the dark. No words were exchanged. The workers filed inside, the door sealed behind them. I crept closer, listening for sounds, screams, machinery, anything, but the silence was absolute. It pressed against my ears like a vacuum. I didn't know it then, but that may have been the first time I brushed against the edges of the Imperium's deepest cruelties. There were facilities in every hive, places where workers were reassigned, places where servitors were made. I didn't know that word yet. If I had, I might have run. Instead, I lingered too long. A glimmer of crimson light swept across the corridor, a Skitarius patrol turning the corner. I dove behind a stack of abandoned crates, pressing my body into the cold metal. Their footsteps were precise, rhythmic, utterly indifferent. They paused. The red glow swept my direction. My breath stopped. I prayed not to the Emperor, who had never answered us, but to the shadows themselves. Then they moved on. It took many minutes before I dared stand. When I finally returned to the barracks, sleep refused to come. My mind replayed what I'd seen, and though I didn't understand it, I sensed a truth waiting to be uncovered. Something that made my bones feel hollow. Life continued. Work continued. Pain continued. But the sense of invisible chains grew heavier. Years later, though time meant little, something happened that would reshape everything. The manufactorum suffered a malfunction in its primary conveyor. A cogitator array overloaded, releasing a burst of sparks that ignited a plume of promethium vapor. The explosion was small, by hive standards, but large enough to throw me across the floor and leave my ears ringing. When I stood, the world swayed. Alarms blared, smoke choked the air. Workers scrambled, shouting, coughing. Overseers descended the stairways, shock staves raised, striking those who moved too slowly. The chaos was thick and disorienting, and in it, I saw something I had never witnessed. Before panic in an overseer's eyes, not fear of us, fear of what the malfunction would cost him, he shoved us into lines, barking for silence. But the cogitator array, damaged beyond quick repair, crackled with warning lights. Something deep within the manufactorum groaned like a giant in pain. The overseers shouted faster, as if volume alone could avert disaster. Then the ceiling groaned. A structural beam, loosened by the explosion, trembled above us. Dust rained down. Someone screamed. I looked up just as the beam tore free. There was no time to think, only react. I dove sideways, slamming into the ground as the beam crashed down where I had been standing. The impact shook the entire manufactorum. When the dust settled, several workers were trapped beneath it. Their cries were muffled, pained. The overseers hesitated, not out of empathy but calculation. Extracting the trapped workers meant stopping production. Stopping production meant answering to the administratum, punishment. For failure always trickled downward, so they left them. The shift was redirected around the beam. The cries eventually stopped. Something inside me cracked that day. Not loudly, not noticeably. Just a small fissure, a fault line forming beneath the surface of my obedience. I began to see the manufactorum differently. The machinery that once seemed eternal now looked fragile. The overseers who once seemed invincible now looked frightened. The hive that once felt unchanging now felt like a beast on the edge of collapse. We were its blood, its fuel, and blood can boil. A few nights later, while the barracks slept under dim lumens, I found myself staring at the ceiling, imagining the stars I had never seen. True stars, not flickering bulbs. I wondered what lay beyond the hive, beyond the planet, beyond the unending toil of my existence. Freedom was a word spoken only in stories, yet the syllables haunted me. They tasted like danger. The invisible chains tightened, and for the first time, I pulled back. Not enough to break them, not yet, but enough to make them tremble, enough to make the hive tremble with them, enough to begin the long, terrifying path towards something the Imperium had never intended for people like me. The faintest spark of rebellion, and sparks, in the presence of promethium, can become fire. There were mornings, if one could call the artificial dimming of lumen strips morning, when waking felt like clawing up from beneath rubble. My limbs ached with a fatigue that never faded, only rearranged itself, settling one day in the shoulders, the next in the spine, and always behind the eyes. Survival here was not a matter of strength but endurance, the quiet stubbornness to move even when your body whispered that stillness would be a far kinder choice. And yet, every worker in the barracks rose when the Vox grill crackled. None dared remain lying down. Rest was the only luxury we could not afford. Rations were distributed at the barrack entrance by a servitor whose skull had been polished to a reflective sheen, the metal hemispheres of its eyes scanning us with indifferent precision. It dispensed nutrient bricks that tasted like chalk soaked in old water, each packet stamped with a date that meant nothing to us. We ate quickly. Hunger was constant, but eating too slowly meant losing your place in the march to the manufactorum, which meant falling behind your shift group. Falling behind meant becoming noticeable, and nothing in this place was more dangerous than being noticed. On the walk through the blood-orange glow of warning lumens, I learned how to conserve every breath. The air was thin, recycled dozens of times before reaching our level, and it scraped the throat with a faint metallic sting. I learned how to keep my face expressionless around overseers, how to bow my head just enough to show obedience but not enough to appear weak. These were survival techniques as important as any physical skill, because the overseers were always watching for signs of fatigue they could twist into accusations of laziness or sabotage. That day, when I entered the manufactorum, the heat struck like a wall. One of the furnaces had been overloaded during the previous shift, radiating waves of smoldering air that pushed workers back before they forced themselves forward. The overseers stood above on the catwalks, shouting quotas through their Vox amplifiers, reminding us that delays would be recorded and deductions made. Deductions meant reduced rations meant death, slow or fast depending on luck. We began our tasks. My job was sorting raw ore fragments as they traveled down a long conveyor belt toward the crushers. I had done it so many times that my hands moved without thought, flicking away impurities, clearing jams, and avoiding the jagged metal teeth. My fingers bore dozens of scars from where I hadn't been fast enough. My right thumb had been crushed once, leaving it twisted, though I learned to hide the injury by adjusting how I gripped the fragments. Showing pain was a weakness. Weakness attracted the overseer's eyes. The hours stretched, though hours were meaningless down here. The only markers of time were the shifts, the breaks that never lasted long enough to ease the ache in your bones, and the sound of alarms signaling machinery faults. Every worker had a story of someone who had leaned too close to the crushers, losing fingers or whole arms. I had seen a man dragged beneath the conveyor once, his scream cut short by the grinding of gears. The conveyor stopped for no one, neither did the overseers. Around midday, if such a word applied, the conveyors shuddered, then halted. The sudden silence felt unnatural, like the manufactorum itself was holding its breath. A murmur rippled through the workers, quickly silenced as overseers descended with shock staves raised. "System recalibration," one barked, though the words held a tremor. Overseers feared malfunctions almost as much as we did. Breakdowns meant inspections from higher authorities, and those rarely ended without bloodshed. We waited in tense lines, sweat dripping down our faces, the heat of the furnaces simmering across skin like invisible flames. A tech adept arrived, his robes stained with oil and machine filth, mechadendrites twitching around him like curious serpents. He inspected the cogitator array that controlled the conveyors, muttering binary prayers through a Vox scrambler. I watched him, noticing how even he seemed uneasy. A tech adept's unease meant the machine spirit was agitated. An agitated machine spirit meant danger. While we waited, I felt a faint tap at my elbow. It was Rena, a girl only a few years older than me, though her eyes looked ancient. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her voice was soft, like someone whispering from far away. "Your hand," she murmured, glancing at my thumb. The skin around it was cracking again, blood seeping through the grime. "It's nothing," I said, though the throbbing was sharp. "Just a scratch." She frowned. "They'll notice." Fear prickled the back of my neck. She was right. Overseers watched for signs of slowness, and injuries were the easiest excuse for punishment. I rubbed grime over the wound, dulling the red. Rena nodded, a small gesture of shared understanding, and stepped back before any overseer could see us speaking. When the conveyors finally restarted with a metallic groan, the shift returned to its grim rhythm, but a seed of dread had settled into my chest. Something was wrong with the machinery today. The vibrations beneath the floor felt uneven, like a heartbeat out of sync. I focused on my work, forcing my thoughts into silence. As the shift dragged on, the air thickened with dust. A worker near me, a man named Havel, began coughing violently, collapsing against the conveyor's edge. His body shook, lungs expelling black phlegm. The overseer above noticed and descended with heavy steps. "Back to work," the overseer barked. "He's filth sick. Happens. He needs a doctor," I said before I realized the words had escaped me. Silence followed. Dozens of eyes flicked toward me, then up to the overseer. My heart froze. The overseer stared at me, shock stave humming. "Say that again," he growled. I lowered my gaze. "Nothing." I misspoke. "You think these workers deserve medical attention?" he sneered, leaning closer. "Filth sickness is the price of their lives. When he can't work, he'll be reassigned." Reassigned. The euphemism every worker dreaded. The word was as heavy as a death sentence. Havel tried to stand, but his legs buckled. The overseer seized him by the collar, dragging him upright with contemptuous strength. Havel's eyes met mine briefly, a flicker of pleading that burned into my memory. Then he was hauled away, disappearing behind a corridor marked for restricted access. No one spoke. No one breathed too loudly. The conveyors kept moving. I felt Rena's gaze on me, a silent warning, never speak again. As the shift neared its end, alarms blared across the manufactorum. Not the malfunction alarms, this was a different sound, sharper, urgent. Overseers shouted orders, pushing us toward the walls as Skitarii entered, through the main gate. Their steps were perfectly synchronized, rifles angled downward but ready. A tall figure followed an administratum officer in grey robes, data slate in hand, expression cold. A workplace inspection. We stood in lines, trembling. Inspections were rare and deadly. The officer stopped in front of us, scanning faces as though looking for signs of heresy. "Productivity has fallen below expected output," he said calmly. "This is unacceptable for Hive Tarsus's contribution quota." His voice was level, polite even, but every word was a blade. "Non-compliant workers will be identified and reassigned," he continued. "Ensure your records are accurate." The overseers straightened, eager to prove loyalty. Some cast glances at us, calculating which workers could be sacrificed to restore their numbers. Rena squeezed her eyes shut. I forced myself not to shake. When the officer stopped before me, he paused. My coat was torn at the sleeve, stained with ore, dust and dried blood. He narrowed his eyes. "What happened to your hand?" he asked. My throat closed. If I told the truth, I would be punished for carelessness. If I lied, I risked worse. Before I could answer, Rena spoke. "He cut it, clearing a jam," she said softly. "Kept the conveyor from clogging. Saved the shift time." The overseer stiffened. I could feel his anger radiate. The officer studied us both, calculating. Efficiency mattered to him more than anything. "Show me," he said. I stepped forward, heart pounding. I demonstrated the motion I used to clear jams. It was the truth. The officer watched intently, then nodded once. "Acceptable. Continue your labor." Relief crashed over me, dizzying. But the overseer's glare promised retribution. When the inspection moved on, Rena leaned close. "You owe me," she whispered, not unkindly. I nodded. I owed her my life, but the overseer did not forget. At the end of the shift, as workers dispersed, he approached me. His expression was calm, almost placid, which frightened me more than anger. "See, 9,482, he said. A word. I followed him to a corner of the manufactorum where the furnace's roar drowned sound. He tapped his shock stave against his palm. "You think you're clever," he said. "No," I murmured. "You think you're special because the administratum spared you." He leaned close, his breath hot and sour. "You're nothing, and tomorrow, when you fall behind, no one will save you." He struck me across the ribs with the stave, not enough to kill, but enough to drop me to my knees. Pain exploded through my side. "Remember your place," he hissed. He left me in the shadows, breathing shallowly, holding my ribs. When I returned to the barracks, Rena was waiting. She saw the way I moved and said nothing, only handed me a strip of cloth torn from her own blanket. I wrapped it around my ribs, every breath sharp. That night, as I lay awake under flickering lumens, I realized something profound. Survival wasn't just physical. It wasn't just endurance. It was the art of navigating cruelty without losing yourself. It was knowing when to speak, when to stay silent, when to break rules, and when to hide. It was finding allies in a world that punished connection. It was recognizing that one day the price of survival might become too high, and it was knowing, deep down, that no one survived forever, but I was still alive, and tomorrow I would rise again, not because I wanted to, but because the alternative was worse. Survival was a choice, a harsh, unending choice, and one day, something inside me whispered, that choice would no longer be enough. Hope was a word we did not speak, yet it lingered like a forbidden scent drifting through the corridors, a faint sweetness in a world of metal and ash. It began with whispers, soft enough to be mistaken for the sigh of the ventilation ducts, and yet unmistakably human. Rumors carried themselves through the barracks after lights out, slipping between bunks like small, desperate creatures seeking warmth. I heard the first one the night after my punishment, when pain still flared across my ribs with every breath. Rena lay on the bunk above me. She was quiet, as always, but the others around us spoke in hushed tones, as though trying to banish their fear by voicing something anything different from the monotony of survival. "They say a whole shift line on sub-level 38 refused orders," someone whispered. "Impossible," another hissed. "No one refuses." "They did," the first said. "And the overseers didn't punish them." "Liar," a third muttered. I stared at the ceiling, each word prickling through my thoughts. Workers refusing orders. It was a fantasy, a dangerous one, yet the whisper did not die. It echoed for days, bending and reshaping itself. Some said the workers were taken away for interrogation. Some claimed they were promoted to better rations. Some insisted they had simply vanished. Truth didn't matter. The rumor itself was power. Hope, in any measure, was heresy. The manufactorum felt different as these whispers spread. The air was still hot and thick, the overseers still brutal, but the workers' eyes held glimmers of something unfamiliar. Not rebellion. Rebellion was too large a word. But perhaps irritation at their chains. A subtle shift in posture, a longer pause before obeying orders, a flicker of something fragile yet uncrushable. Then came the second rumor. "They killed an overseer," someone whispered during the ration line. "In the lower pits." Rena stiffened beside me. I kept my eyes forward, but the words lodged in my skull like shrapnel. "Who told you that?" another asked. "Someone who saw the body." "You'll get us killed." "Fine. Believe nothing. That's what they want." The idea of anyone killing an overseer was beyond comprehension. Not because they were strong, they weren't. Not because they were many, they weren't. But because the Imperium had built them into our world as untouchable pillars of authority. To strike one was to strike the system itself, and the system always struck back harder. Yet even lies can spark thought. Hope did not need truth to take root. It only needed hunger. And we were all starving for something that tasted different from despair. Days passed. My ribs healed slowly. I kept to myself during shifts, working silently, enduring the overseer's glare with practiced indifference. But I felt the atmosphere shifting. Havel's death, the malfunction, the inspection, they were cracks in the facade of power, and every worker sensed cracks invite light or collapse. One evening, as we filed back into the barracks, Rena brushed against my shoulder. Her voice was barely audible. "Don't sleep," she whispered. "Not yet," I nodded, though confusion swirled. She returned to her bunk. I lay still, pretending exhaustion, waiting until the lumen strips dimmed to their night, setting a faint purple glow that barely cut through the gray. I heard her move before I saw her. She slipped from her bunk and tapped my shoulder. Her silhouette blended into the shadows, but her presence was unmistakable. "Follow me," she murmured. We moved quietly through the sleeping rows, careful not to disturb anyone, or perhaps careful not to wake the wrong ones. Some workers were too loyal to the overseers, too afraid to listen to whispers. They would report anything unusual in exchange for a single extra ration brick. Rena led me through the far door, down the service corridor that smelled of coolant and mold. My pulse quickened. The last time I had followed someone into a secluded part of the hive, I had nearly been discovered by Skitarii. But something in Rena's steady movements softened my fear. "Where are we going?" I asked softly. "To listen," she said. She stopped at an old ventilation grate, rusted at the edges. Behind it, faint voices drifted through the ductwork, muffled but distinct enough to follow. Rena knelt, gesturing for silence. I bent beside her, pressing my ear to the metal. What I heard made my breath catch. "Tonight we choose," a man whispered. "We can't keep losing people," another voice answered, harsher. "If the overseers discover us, we die. We die anyway," the first said. "At least this way, we choose how it happens." A pause, then another voice, soft, trembling. "Is it true that the upper workers revolted on sub-level 38? "It's true enough," the first voice said. "Whether it happened or not doesn't matter. The idea." Rena looked at me. Her eyes gleamed faintly. "They're planning something," I whispered. "No," she murmured. "They're dreaming something." The distinction was important. Dreams were safer than rebellion. Dreams could be contained. rebellion could not. But dreams had sharp edges and dangerous weight. They could slice through the numbness that kept us obedient. The voices continued. We strike when the conveyors stop. When the machine's spirit cycles, that's when they're vulnerable. If we fail, we vanish. Same as always. Rena pulled me back gently before I could hear more. We crept away from the grate, hearts hammering. In the dim corridor, she turned to me. You asked why people return from restricted zones looking haunted, she whispered. It's because they know what happens to those who resist. And still, some choose to resist. And you? I asked. She hesitated. I don't know yet. Why show me? This? Because you're already thinking differently, she said. I saw it when you spoke up for Havel. That was a mistake. No, that was the first honest thing you've ever done. Her words unsettled me. Honesty was dangerous. Honesty exposed you. But they lingered like an ember under skin. That night, sleep refused to come. The voices in the vent, the whispers in the barracks, the rumors all wove themselves into a single thread of thought. Perhaps our suffering wasn't destiny. Perhaps obedience wasn't survival. Perhaps we weren't as powerless as the Imperium needed us to believe. Yet hope terrified me more than any overseer's shock stave. Hope made you stand taller. Standing taller made you visible. And visibility was death. The next shift began with a strange tension. Workers moved more cautiously, eyes flicking toward overseers, toward each other, toward the machinery that groaned and clanked, as if aware of our uneasy thoughts. Even the overseers sensed something. Their commands were sharper, their punishments quicker. Halfway through the shift, a sudden silence rippled through the manufactorum. A worker had collapsed, his body convulsing. Another knelt beside him. The overseer hesitated this time, not out of compassion, but out of suspicion. "What's going on?" he demanded. The kneeling worker looked up, eyes blazing. "He's dying," she snarled. "You starved him." It was the first openly rebellious tone I had ever heard. The overseer raised his stave, but the woman did not back away. And for a heartbeat, the entire manufactorum froze. The crackling electricity from the stave, the furnace roar, the conveyor grind, it all fell away into a single moment suspended between submission and rupture. But the overseer broke it first. The stave came down. The woman fell. Order was restored. And yet, something had shifted. Rena caught my eye across the floor, her gaze filled with unspoken understanding. That, the moment the brief challenge had been seen by dozens, it could not be erased. Whispers would multiply tonight. When the shift ended, the barracks hummed with quiet conversation as workers recounted the scene. Some spoke with fear, others with awe, a few with simmering anger. I lay on my bunk, staring upward, feeling the hive itself tremble with change. Rena climbed down from her bunk and sat beside me. "You heard the voices," she murmured. "You saw what happened today. You know what's coming." "I don't know anything," I said, though the lie felt thin. "You know enough," she answered. I let out a slow breath. "Hope is dangerous. So is despair," she said quietly. "But at least hope gives you something to die for." Her words lodged deep. The hive's machinery thrummed through the walls, a relentless reminder of our place. Yet tonight, that sound felt different. Not oppressive, not absolute, more like a challenge. The whispers were growing louder, dangerously loud, and for the first time, I didn't want them to stop. I wanted to hear more. I wanted to know what choosing meant. I wanted to know what freedom, even whispered, felt like in the lungs, in the blood. Something inside me was waking, and the Imperium, in all its indifference, had no idea what it had created. The night the whispers finally broke open came without warning, though in truth the signs had been gathering like dust on the vents for weeks. It began with a shift in the air, an electric, breath-catching tension that clung to every corridor and every bunk. Even the lumen strips flickered more than usual, as though the hive itself were nervous. That morning, when the klaxons blared and we marched into the manufactorum, the workers moved with a strange synchronicity. Their footsteps felt heavier, firmer, as if for the first time they could feel the weight of their own bodies, rather than the weight of obedience pressing down on them. I found myself scanning the faces around me. Rena's jaw was set, her eyes sharp, her movements precise, Her conviction was a quiet storm gathering beneath calm waters. Others carried a similar charge, subtle shifts in posture, in the angle of their gaze, in the way they gripped their tools. Even those who feared change sensed something inevitable in the air, like a furnace cycle that could no longer be halted. The overseers, oblivious to nuance, only barked louder, mistaking tension for laziness. The first spark came halfway through the shift. The conveyors stuttered to a sudden halt, a rare malfunction, one that usually brought robed tech priests rushing in with Binharic chants. But today, no one moved. No overseer reacted. No worker rushed to clear the jam. Instead, a frozen pause spread through the manufactorum like a shockwave. Then a tremor of raised voices echoed from the far row. "Move!" an overseer shouted. "Clear the line." But the worker standing nearest to the conveyor didn't move. His name was Jorel Tall, gaunt, with eyes that held a depth of exhaustion deeper than most. He had lost 2 brothers in the same month to machine accidents. He'd survived only because he had never allowed himself to care about anything, not even his own survival. Until now, the overseer jabbed him with a shock stave. Jorel didn't flinch. "Is something wrong with your hearing?" the overseer snarled. "No," Jorel said, and his voice rang clearer than any industrial clank. "Something's wrong with yours." The overseer blinked, confused, as though he'd misheard. Workers along the line went still. Someone sucked in a sharp breath. Someone else whispered, "He's going to die." The overseer raised the stave again, but his hesitation, small as it was enough to fracture the illusion of unstoppable authority. Jorel stepped forward, grabbed the stave with both hands, and shoved the overseer backward. The sound of metal on metal stave clattering to the floor was louder than the furnace roar. It was louder than the clatter of servitors, louder than the churning gears, louder than the heartbeats suddenly racing across the entire manufactorum. For a moment, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. Workers surged forward, some in pure instinct, some in rage, some in a buried hunger for something unnamed. The overseer fell beneath the wave of bodies. Shouts echoed. Someone screamed. Someone laughed. Someone cried. The sound became a dam bursting. I stood frozen, the world tilting around me. Rena grabbed my wrist. "Move," she hissed. "Where?" I whispered. "Anywhere but here." She dragged me through the frenzied crowd. Workers shoved past, some heading for the exits, some toward the overseers, some toward the giant furnaces, as though seeking destruction or liberation. Overseers responded with panicked blows, striking at anyone within reach. But there were too many of us, far too many. Their power had always been illusion built on fear, and fear was crumbling. We reached a maintenance corridor near the back wall, where the noise was muffled but still thunderous. Rena leaned against the cold metal, breathing hard. "It started," she said softly. "I thought, Emperor, forgive me, I thought it might fail to happen." "This isn't a revolt," I said. "It's panic." "It's both," she replied. "One becomes the other." A distant explosion rattled the corridor, sending dust down from the ceiling. It wasn't large, probably a ruptured promethium line, but it was enough to split screams from shouts. I swallowed a rising wave of dread. "What do we do?" I asked. Rena's expression shifted, torn between resolve and fear. "We survive," she said. "We survive whatever comes next." A harsh klaxon blared through the manufactorum, signaling security lockdown. Red emergency lights bathed the corridor, turning dust into drifting embers. Loudspeaker Vox units crackled with static before a stern voice took over. "All workers return to stations. Lethal force authorized. Comply immediately." The words repeated, cycling every few seconds, each iteration growing sharper, more desperate. The Imperium spoke with iron certainty, but beneath it was the unmistakable crackle of losing control. Footsteps thundered from the direction of the access gate, heavy, metallic steps timed with machine precision. Skitarii. My blood ran cold. "We need to leave," Rena whispered. "Now." We sprinted deeper into the corridor, weaving through maintenance shafts and supply alcoves. The manufactorum was a maze, but one we knew intimately. It was our prison, our world, our grave in waiting. The clatter of weapons fire echoed behind us. Screams followed. The revolt, if it could be called that, was being extinguished with brutal efficiency. We reached a junction where the walls widened into a storage chamber. A few workers huddled there, eyes wild with fear. One of them, a man with a split brow bleeding down his cheek, stepped forward. "Did we win?" he asked, voice shaking. Rena's silence was answer enough. He sank to the floor, trembling. Another worker spoke up, her voice cracking. "If they find us, we die." "They'll find us," Rena said quietly, "but not if we move." We continued on, down a narrow passage lit by flickering emergency strips. The air grew hotter the deeper we went. Somewhere nearby, a furnace line had ruptured. The scent of burning metal and vaporized promethium clung to our tongues. As we walked, the distant gunfire dulled into sporadic bursts. The screams faded. The revolt was dying, but a strange numbness settled in, not despair but grim acceptance. This was the price of voice. This was the price of daring to speak. The passage eventually led to a sealed bulkhead. I recognized it, an emergency barrier designed to protect the lower pits during pressure failures. It had no keypad, only a heavy turning wheel that required strength we barely had. Rena and I pushed together, muscles trembling. After several agonizing moments, the wheel groaned and shifted, opening enough for us to slip through. Beyond lay silence. The lower pits were seldom visited by workers not assigned there. The air was colder, the ceiling lower, the lights dimmer. Condensation dripped from pipes overhead, forming shallow puddles along the walkway. The machinery here slept dark, looming silhouettes. "This place feels wrong," I whispered. "It always does," Rena answered. We moved cautiously, footsteps echoing in the cavernous dark. A subtle hum vibrated through the walls, the dormant heartbeat of the hive, waiting to awaken. It felt like walking inside the ribcage of a dead giant. Then, faintly, we heard movement. Not the clatter of skitari, not the bark of overseers. Footsteps soft, uncertain, human. We exchanged a glance and approached. In a small alcove, several workers huddled around a fallen figure, their faces lit by a single lumen lantern. They looked like ghosts. Rena knelt beside the fallen worker. He was young, barely older than me. A deep wound tore across his abdomen, staining his tunic crimson. "He was caught by security," one woman whispered. "We pulled him down here before they saw us." The young worker's gaze flickered toward me. Did we make a difference?" The question pierced more deeply than any blade. Rena hesitated. "You showed them we can stand," she said softly. "That matters." His breath hitched, then stilled. Silence settled over us. His death was not noble, it was not strategic, it was not glorious. It was the kind of death the Imperium specialized in, wasteful, forgotten, unrecorded. And yet, as we stood there, I realized something had changed within me. Fear no longer dictated every corner of my mind. In its place was something harder, sharper, resolve. Rena placed her hand on the young worker's chest briefly, a gesture so small it would have gone unnoticed by anyone not looking directly at her. Then she stood. "We can't stay here," she said. "The skitari will sweep every level." "And when they find us?" someone asked. Rena looked toward the upper levels, where faint smoke curled through the ventilation ducts. "Then we choose," she said, "for the first time." The group fell silent. Then, one by one, they nodded, and I understood, in that moment, that the revolt had not failed, not entirely. Its violence had been crushed. Its spark had been stamped out, but its meaning, its echo, its defiance had taken root in us, not in action, not yet, but in thought. And thoughts, once ignited, were far harder to kill than bodies. We walked deeper into the pits, the future uncertain, danger certain, hope bitter but alive. Above us, the manufactorum burned. Below us, something new stirred, and for the first time, I felt the weight of chains not as destiny but as something that could be broken. The lower pits swallowed us in a cold so profound it felt older than the hive itself, a stagnant chill that clung to the skin like a forgotten memory. We moved through the narrow passages in a quiet line, our footsteps echoing softly against rusted steel. None of us dared speak, not because silence kept us safe, but because anything louder than a whisper felt sacrilegious in this place, as though the darkness itself were listening. The revolt above had burned bright and died quickly, but its ashes drifted into every corridor, filling the air with a metallic taste that lingered on the tongue. As we walked, dim lumen globes flickered sporadically overhead, casting long shadows that danced across the pipes in erratic patterns. Every few minutes a distant tremor shivered through the walls. Whether it was the aftermath of the chaos above, or just the machinery settling back into its pitiless rhythm, none of us could say. Rena led the group, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed ahead. If she felt fear, she hid it well. I followed close behind, my thoughts shifting like sand under a storm wind. I could not stop replaying the dead worker's final question. Did we make a difference? It echoed inside me, quieter now, but insistent. And with every step, I felt the answer growing heavier. The path eventually opened into a cavernous chamber filled with dormant machinery, titangent-sized gears, long idle conveyor arms, and shattered plasma welders sat in silent rows, relics of forgotten industry. The only light came from a collection of small lanterns, placed in a loose circle around a group of huddled figures. Their faces turned toward us as we approached, eyes gleaming with a mixture of hope, suspicion, and bone-deep exhaustion. One of them, a broad-shouldered woman with a stitched scar running from her jaw to her ear, stepped forward. She held a metal rod like a makeshift club. "Who are you?" she asked. "Workers," Rena said. "Same as you." The woman studied us. "From above?" Rena nodded. "What happened?" Someone else whispered. Rena's eyes darkened. "The revolt is over. Security crushed it before it spread." A murmur rippled through the group, some moaning softly, some cursing under their breath. The woman lowered her makeshift weapon, her shoulders sagging with a quiet exhale. "So it failed." "No," Rena said, and her voice carried a sharpness that cut through the chamber. "It wasn't meant to succeed. Not yet," silence answered her. Not disbelief, just the stillness of people trying to understand the shape of something new forming inside them. One of the younger workers stepped forward, his face gaunt, but his eyes bright. "If there's no hope of victory, then why fight at all?" Rena looked at him with an expression I'd never seen on her before, part sorrow, part admiration. "Because they want us compliant," she said. "Because they want us silent. Because every breath we take without permission threatens the order they built. The revolt wasn't a battle, it was a message." The young worker swallowed. "To who?" "To us," I said, surprising myself. Everyone looked at me. "To remind us that we're still alive." The words left my mouth before I fully understood them, but once spoken, they felt true. The revolt had been small, doomed, and brutally crushed, and yet something had cracked open, something that would never be sealed again. The scarred woman sighed. "So what now?" Rena turned to me, and for a fleeting instant I saw the uncertainty flicker behind her eyes. She didn't know, none of us did, and that was the most terrifying part. We were no longer following orders, we were carving a path blind through the dark. "We wait," Rena said finally. "We gather, we learn who we can trust. We survive long enough to choose our moment instead of dying in theirs." Some nodded, others frowned, but no one argued. The group settled into a loose semicircle around the lanterns. The air felt warmer there, though the warmth came more from shared presence than from the dim light. Someone handed out ration scraps, hard bread, dried fungus, nutrient paste stolen from mess lines. We ate quietly, each bite tasting of guilt and necessity. As I sat there, listening to the faint hum of the machinery and the even fainter murmur of anxious breathing, a strange feeling crept over me. Not comfort. Nothing in the Imperium ever resembled comfort, but something adjacent to belonging. These people, bruised and terrified though they were, had chosen not to scatter. They had chosen to remain together. In a world where isolation was the Imperium's greatest weapon, unity was a radical act. Rena leaned toward me. "You did well," she whispered. "I didn't do anything," I whispered back. "You spoke," she said. "Sometimes that's more than enough." Her words settled in me like embers, small, glowing, dangerous. The night, or what passed night in the depth of the hive, stretched on. Some slept, curled against the cold floor. Others took turns watching the entryways, ears straining for any sign of Skitterai patrols. I sat awake, staring at the rust-speckled ceiling, listening to the faint droplets sliding from pipes above. I wondered how many workers had died in the revolt. How many bodies lay cooling on the manufactorum floor, destined either for incineration or for the nutrient processors. Human life meant nothing here, less than nothing. Yet that truth, once weaponized by the Imperium, felt like it could be turned back against them. If life meant nothing to them, then death meant nothing either. And if death meant nothing, then fear lost half its power. Somewhere in the middle of those thoughts, a soft scraping echoed from the far tunnel. Every head turned. The scarred woman raised her makeshift rod again. "Lights low," she hissed. Lanterns dimmed, shadows thickened. We waited. The scraping grew louder, slow, dragging, uneven. My pulse quickened. Images from horror stories whispered among workers surfaced in my mind. Escaped servitors, broken machines wandering without orders, creatures from the sump pits, scavengers with a taste for flesh. The sound drew closer. A figure stepped into the faint glow, staggering, limping, one hand pressed to his ribs. Blood soaked his shirt. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Rena rushed forward. "Darlin'," she breathed, "you're alive." He collapsed into her arms. Workers hurried to help him down. Someone pressed a cloth to his wound. Others offered water. His breaths came in ragged gasps. "Security swept the upper sections," he wheezed. "They're hunting anyone who fled. They're sealing levels behind them as they go." Fear rippled through us like electricity. "Are they coming here?" the young worker asked, voice tight. Dalen coughed, spitting blood. "They will. They're checking every unused chamber, every tunnel." The scarred woman clenched her jaw. "Then we move deeper." "There is no deeper," someone whispered. "This is the lowest level before the waste sluices." Rena's eyes darted around the chamber, thinking fast. "There are maintenance shafts beneath the sluices," she said. "No one uses them. They're half flooded, poisoned, but they connect to other sections of the hive." "That's suicide," the woman said. "It's survival," Rena replied. "And it's the only chance we have." A heavy silence followed. Finally, the scarred woman nodded. "Then we go." We lifted the lanterns and gathered our meager supplies. Dalen was carried by 2 workers, though he insisted he could walk. He could not, but none of us said anything. The path to the waste sluices was narrow and winding, clogged with grime. The stench grew stronger with every step, a nauseating blend of industrial rot and chemical decay. The hum of distant pumps vibrated through the floor. When we reached the sluice intake, a wide grate blocked the way. Its metal bars were thick, corroded, but still solid. "How do we get through?" someone asked. Rena knelt, examining the bolts. "We don't, but we can go around." She pointed to a smaller hatch beside the main channel, nearly hidden under layers of rust and grime. "Maintenance access," she said. "Meant for servitors." We worked together to pry it open. The hinges screamed in protest, but they gave way. Beyond the hatch lay a narrow tunnel, dark, wet, sloping downward into unknown black. The air that wafted out was foul enough to make several workers gag. "No turning back," Rena murmured. She stepped inside. We followed her, one by one, swallowed by the tunnel. The descent felt endless, the floor slick beneath our boots, the walls narrowing until our shoulders brushed metal, the smell intensifying until it became a physical pressure. Lanterns flickered. Someone retched behind me. Someone else whispered prayers to the Emperor. Under their breath, old words said more out of habit than faith. But through it all, we moved, because movement meant life, because movement meant choice. When we finally emerged into a wider chamber, the air felt marginally cleaner. Faint air currents brushed past our faces. Pipes overhead dripped steadily into a basin, forming ripples that shimmered in the lantern light. "We made it," someone exhaled. "Not yet," Rena said quietly, "but we will." I looked around at the weary faces illuminated in the glow, frightened, determined, bruised, alive. Something unspoken pulsed between us, something fragile yet profound. We were not free, we were not safe, but we were together, and for the first time, that felt like the beginning of something greater than survival. It felt like the faint shape of a dawn, not bright, not warm, but real enough to believe in. A dawn the Imperium had never intended slaves to see, a dawn we would fight to reach, whatever it cost.